late 18th century, Europe was a continent in turmoil. The French Revolution had shattered centuries of monarchy, replacing kings with chaos and uncertainty. In the middle of this upheaval, a young officer from the island of Corsica was beginning his rise. Napoleon Bonaparte left home for military school in France when he was only 10 years old. Though he was an outsider with a thick Corsican accent, he quickly distinguished himself as a serious student. He excelled in mathematics, studied military strategy, and trained in artillery, all of which being skills that would define his future on the battlefield. Back in France, the government was weak and unstable. Corruption and political conflict had left the country desperate for strong leadership. In November of 1799, Napoleon seized his moment. In a political takeover known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire, Napoleon overthrew the existing government and established a new system called the Consulate. At the center of it all stood Napoleon himself, at first consul, the most powerful man in France. In less than a decade, a young outsider from Corsica had risen from military student to a ruler of a nation. And his ambition was only the beginning.
By the early 1800s, Napoleon had secured control of France, but winning battles was only a fraction of his ambition. In 1804, Napoleon introduced his codified law, the Napoleonic Code. For centuries, France had been governed by a swath of local laws and feudal traditions. Napoleon sought to replace that system with a single unified set of laws for the entire nation. Most notably, the Code established equality before the law. Under this system, citizens will be judged by the same legal standards regardless of social class. The Code also abolished feudalism, ending many of the privileges once reserved only for the aristocracy. It further guaranteed property ownership as a fundamental right, protecting people's ability to own and transfer land and wealth. And to enforce these new laws, Napoleon created standardized courts, ensuring that legal decisions would follow the same rules throughout France. Napoleon also relied on intelligence and espionage to secure victories on the battlefield. One of his most effective agents was Karl Schulmeister, a spy who played a crucial role in the siege of Ulm. Disguised as a Hungarian officer, Schulmeister infiltrated the besieged city of Ulm and gained the trust of Austrian General Karl Mack. He delivered false information, including a fabricated newspaper that claimed Napoleon would be overthrown soon. Believing the French troops would be withdrawn shortly, General Mack surrendered his forces, handing the city to Napoleon on a silver platter. Through law, intelligence, and control, Napoleon strengthened his grip on France and expanded his influence across Europe. But the greater his empire grew, the more powerful enemies he created. And soon, those enemies would begin to fight back.
Up to this point, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. As Emperor of France, he controlled and influenced much of Europe. Through a series of brilliant military campaigns, Napoleon had defeated powerful nations, including Austria, Prussia, and Russia. At its peak, Napoleon's empire stretched across most of the mainland Europe. Kings had been replaced by Napoleon's allies and family members. And French influence reshaped the politics all over the continent. But maintaining such a massive empire required constant control and constant war. One of Napoleon's greatest rivals remained beyond his reach, Great Britain. Unable to defeat the British Navy, Napoleon attempted a different strategy known as the Continental System. This policy attempted to weaken Britain by cutting off trade between Britain and the rest of Europe. But enforcing the system proved difficult, and many countries resisted the restrictions. When Russia began ignoring the Continental System, Napoleon decided to take action. In 1812, he launched one of the largest military campaigns Europe has ever seen. Nearly 600,000 soldiers, known as the Grand Armée, marched into Russia. Napoleon expected a decisive victory. Instead, he encountered a strategy designed to destroy his army without even fighting any major battles. As the French advanced deeper in Russia, Russian forces retreated, deeper and deeper, destroying crops, villages, and supplies behind them. This strategy, known as Scorched Earth, left Napoleon's army without food or shelter. The two sides finally clashed at the Battle of Borodino, one of the bloodiest battles of Napoleon's wars. Although Napoleon technically held the field, the victory came at an enormous cost. When Napoleon's army finally reached Moscow, the city had been abandoned, and much of it was on fire. Without supplies and with winter approaching, Napoleon was forced to retreat. The retreat from Russia became a disaster. Harsh winter conditions, starvation, and constant attacks from Russian forces devastated the French army. Of the hundreds of thousands who marched into Russia, only a small fraction returned. Napoleon's defeat in Russia shattered the illusion of his invincibility across Europe. Rival nations saw their opportunity. The emperor who once dominated the continent now faced a growing coalition determined to bring his rule to an end. The final chapter in Napoleon's story was about to begin.
After the disastrous invasion of Russia, Napoleon's empire began to unravel. Across Europe, former enemies united, forming a powerful coalition determined to end his rule once and for all. In 1814, after a series of defeats, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne. He was exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba, his empire seemingly finished. But for Napoleon Bonaparte, exile was not the end. In March of 1815, he escaped Elba and returned to France, risking everything for one final chance at power. As he marched towards Paris, troops that were originally sent to arrest him quickly converted to his side. His legend and his influence remained as powerful as ever. Within weeks, Napoleon had reclaimed the throne. This brief return to power became known as the 100 Days. But the nations of Europe responded immediately. Determined not to repeat past mistakes, Britain, Prussia, and all their allies prepared for final confrontation. Napoleon moved quickly, hoping to strike his enemies before they could fully unite. His plan was to defeat the British and Prussian armies separately. On June 18th of 1815, near the village of Waterloo, which is in present-day Belgium, Napoleon faced the army of British commander, the Duke of Wellington. The battle began slowly. Rain-soaked ground delayed the French attack, costing Napoleon valuable time. When the fighting finally began, French forces launched repeated assaults against the British lines, attempting to break their defenses. Wave after wave of infantry and cavalry charged forward. Their fighting was intense, chaotic, and relentless. Despite heavy pressure, Wellington's forces held their ground. As the battle dragged on, a new threat appeared on the horizon. Prussian forces, led by General Blucher, began arriving on the battlefield. Now both outnumbered and surrounded, Napoleon's army began to lose momentum. His final gamble was quickly slipping away. In a last attempt to secure victory, Napoleon sent in his most elite troops, known as the Imperial Guard. For years, the Imperial Guard had never been defeated, but at Waterloo, even they could not turn the tide. Under heavy fire, the Guard was forced to retreat, and with that, the French army collapsed into chaos. Soldiers fled the battlefield as the coalition forces advanced. The Battle of Waterloo marked Napoleon's final defeat. This time, however, there would be no return. Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, far from Europe and far from power. There, he would spend the remaining years of his life reflecting on the empire he had built and lost. Napoleon Bonaparte's life was one of extraordinary rise and dramatic fall. From a young boy sent to military school, at just 10 years old, he rose to command armies, crowned himself emperor, and dominate much of Europe. He reshaped governments, reformed legal systems, and left a lasting mark through the Napoleonic Code, all of which being principles that still influence modern law today. But his ambition came at a massive cost. Years of warfare brought destruction across Europe and claimed countless lives. Even now, historians continue to debate his legacy. Was he a hero of the revolution or a ruler consumed by power? Perhaps he was both, a brilliant strategist, a determined leader, a man whose ambition reshaped a continent. Napoleon Bonaparte not only witnessed history, he made it.